Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the aesthetics of Twitch gameplay in video games. And we're going to start with an overview. First, we'll discuss the question of what do we mean by aesthetics. Then we'll give a sort of rough and ready definition of what counts as Twitch gameplay in video games. We'll move to the central problem in aesthetically appreciating video games, after which we'll look at two replies to the central problem. We're going to restate the central problem in the light of these two replies, and then after that, we'll try our best to answer the restated version of the central problem. Finally, we'll conclude with a discussion of what might count as harmonious movements in video games. What do we mean by aesthetics? Well, we're going to stipulate for our conversation that aesthetics is going to mean a combination of two concepts. So the word is going to stand for a concept, and the concept is going to combine two major features. And one of these features dates back from the ancient origins of the term aesthetics, which is in a cluster of cognate Greek terms, which are aesthesis, aesthetikos, and asthenomai. And those words in turn are traceable to a Proto-Indo-European word, ho. This Proto-Indo-European word, ho, means something like, or meant something like, to perceive or to sense. So one piece of the puzzle is going to have to do with perception and sensation, and we're going to combine this concept of perception and sensation that we find dating back through ancient Greek language into Proto-Indo-European. We're going to combine that idea of perception and sensation with a second, more modern idea, which you can start to understand when you think about the fact that in everyday life in the present world, in the 21st century, if you'd actually talk to someone in the street or at a party or at some sort of occasion and ask them what they do for a living, and if they told you that they were an esthetician, I think generally you would assume, rightly, that they were some sort of person or worker in the industry which produces beautiful skin or beautiful skin, hair, and nails. So from that kind of modern meaning from everyday life of what an esthetician is and does, we're going to look at the concept of beauty and ugliness, and especially, above all, harmony, which we'll come back to and focus on later. So putting these two concepts together, we get aesthetics as something like the exploration of the perception and experience of beauty and harmony and ugliness and other aesthetic phenomena. Okay, so there we have something about, we're just kind of going to stipulate this. This is what we mean by aesthetics. All right. What do we mean by Twitch gameplay? Well, I think that one way to start to get at it is to kind of think about some classic examples. So some classic examples of video games where Twitch gameplay is at the center of the experience are Pac-Man, Frogger, and Punch-Out. What do these three video games have in common other than they are exemplars of classic Twitch gameplay? Well, here's one suggestion of what it is that we can say is common to the gameplay involved in these classic video games. Twitch gameplay is gameplay that calls for and affords more or less continual, complex, varying, brisk-paced, and difficult bodily movements, with prominent traditional input methods being a joystick and buttons, or a gamepad. So it looks like what these classic arcade video games share in common with respect to Twitch gameplay is a difficult sequence of bodily movements where these bodily movements are directed to some sort of an in-game or game world task or some game world goal. So that's going to be what we're talking about when we talk about Twitch gameplay. Now, many contemporary video games include a lot more than Twitch gameplay. So, for example, many contemporary open world adventure games include puzzle elements, include Twitch gameplay, include world building, include exploration, and so on and so forth. So it's important to keep in mind that we're going to only look at those elements of these larger experiences that many modern video games are that really focus on this difficult sequence of bodily movements. Next, we're going to talk about the central problem, which I've called the problem or the argument from extreme difficulty. And this problem is the following, namely, how do we play video games? And really, again, we're talking about Twitch gameplay more than just playing video games. So the problem, no, not the problem, the problem is the following, that Twitch gameplay essentially requires us to dedicate our attention maximally. Okay, what does this mean? By the way, feel free to identify and correct any spelling errors. The problem is that Twitch gameplay requires maximal attention. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that suppose that aesthetic appreciation also requires a significant degree of attention. So if we think about maybe traditional aesthetic appreciation of various art forms, for example, painting. When we're viewing a painting, it seems like arguably that this also requires maybe, at least in some instances, maximal attention. For example, some have had the experience of being so struck by the sight of a painting that as they attended it more closely, they were unable to continue doing other activities, like having a conversation. Relatedly, some people sometimes close their eyes while listening to a piece of music to allow them to better focus on it. But if aesthetically appreciating a painting requires maximal attention and Twitch gameplay also requires maximal attention, then it looks like one of the two is going to lose out. Either we're not going to be able to properly play the Twitch elements of a video game, or we're not going to properly appreciate the aesthetic features really of that same video game. It's not of something else. And I think we can think of various kinds of physical activities where, similarly to Twitch gameplay, there are some difficult, challenging, complex sequence of physical movements that are required from the agent or the actor. And because of that, they're not capable of appreciating, let's say, other features of that activity. An example of this might be if you're bicycling in the Tour de France. If you look at the beautiful scenery around you and you focus on aesthetically appreciating, so to speak, that element of the experience of the ride, then you won't be able to direct your attention sufficiently to the activity of winning the race. So it looks like there's a kind of mutual, if not incompatibility, then at least a tension between the attention required to aesthetically appreciate a given phenomenon and the attention required to do that activity, especially insofar as that activity has certain kinds of rules and explicit goals toward which the agent is directed. Now, I'll just read a quote that's illustrative of someone who's raised something like this problem of the incompatibility of attention. Video games solicit intense concentration from the player who is caught up in their mechanisms, leaving little room for reflection other than an instrumental type of thinking. And the idea in that passage is that instrumental thinking, in some sense, either excludes or at least puts pressure on aesthetic appreciation or aesthetic kinds of thinking, as it were. So that's our statement of the problem, and now we're going to look at two potential solutions. Let's look at two replies to the central problem. And these replies are going to be what I will call the reflective appreciation of Twitch video games and what I will call the performative appreciation. And you'll notice as I talk about these that there's a certain sense in which they're maybe a little bit orthogonal to the real core problem, and so we're going to restate the problem in a moment once we talk about the reflective appreciation and the performative appreciation. So here's a passage that I think illustrates well the notion of the reflective appreciation of video games in general, but it ought to also apply to Twitch gameplay. Absorption in the current play of a game is consistent with reflection on the game itself over time. By attending to repeated displays and how they change as a result of their actions, players attend to the game as generating a range of possibilities. That opens up room for reflection on the game itself. The idea there is that there's a way in which by continuing to play a Twitch video game or the Twitch gameplay elements of that game, we can come to think about our own acts as kind of aesthetic objects. So we can reflect on the choices that we made, the actions that we took in trying to achieve this goal, and derive a kind of significance from that reflection. So for example, suppose that I'm playing a game like Pac-Man and I don't even get all of the dots on the first level. Then I play again and I make some different movement in the sequence of trying to finish the level, but fail again. And I try again and again and eventually I succeed. There's some sense in which after I finally succeed, I can think back on my entire experience of trying to become more excellent, and in that reflective appreciation come to really sort of understand some of the reasons why people say that this video game Pac-Man can generate aesthetic excellence or something like that. So there's a reflective style of appreciation for Twitch gameplay and video games that have a lot of Twitch gameplay in them. What about the performative approach? Well, there's also a corresponding passage that I think well illustrates the performative approach as well. The aesthetics of video game performance is substantive and theoretically significant, and the aesthetics of video game performance is importantly distinct from the aesthetics of performance in other areas. The idea there is that we can think of someone playing a video game as in some ways analogous to someone who's engaging in a theatrical performance, let's say. And we can evaluate their performance along the same lines as we would if we were looking at someone in the theater. And so in that way, if we think of the video game player as a kind of performer, and we think that we can appreciate performances of players in video games similarly to how we can appreciate performances of people in the theater, then it looks like we have another avenue with which to kind of attack this problem of the competing attention between aesthetic appreciation and Twitch gameplay. So what we're going to do now is try to reformulate the problem in order to avoid these two replies. And the way we do that is by adding effectively sort of two stipulations. One stipulation that has to do with the player in the moment, so to speak. So if we restrict our attention to the experiences of a video game player in the moment, then that kind of like blocks the move to reflective appreciation. And similarly, if we focus on the experiences of the player themselves and not an observer, then again, that will similarly block the appeal to a kind of performative appreciation, because we're not sort of distinguishing between the observer of a performance and the performance. We're talking about, as it were, the performer's own capacity to appreciate their performance. And by doing that, we kind of make it more difficult to adopt these replies. And I'll read a kind of a little bit more formal of a statement of the revised version of the problem. It is sometimes necessary, during the most challenging moments of sufficiently difficult playings of Twitch video games, for the player themselves to devote their attention to a maximal degree to the gameplay tasks at hand. These tasks require continual, complex, intense, and reactive bodily movements from the player, such that Twitch gameplay engagement by the player varies inversely with their capacity to engage with other facets of the video game, including aesthetic ones. Being extremely challenging with respect to the bodily movements requisite for gameplay success is often a significant contributing factor to the excellence of Twitch video games. Therefore, part of what makes Twitch video games excellent is precisely that which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the player to engage with them aesthetically while they are playing, such that in this way, their excellence is inversely related to their capacity to be engaged with aesthetically. All right, so that's just a kind of sophisticated way of saying what I just said about blocking reflective appreciation and performative appreciation by focusing on the experiences of the player in the moment and focusing on the ability of the player themselves to engage in aesthetic appreciation. Now, ultimately, the argument is going to be that, well, there's a reply to this version too, all right? So there's another reply. A new reply. And this new reply is directed toward this issue of in the moment. And the way it's going to work is, first, we're going to kind of look at a case that seems similar but is actually slightly different. So it seems like it might be a solution, but I'm going to suggest that it's not really a solution, even though it seems like it is. So the new reply, we're going to start by looking at an apparent solution. And the apparent solution involves recognizing some relevantly similar or analogous activity that involves difficult bodily movement, and yet the person who's engaged in that movement is still capable of aesthetic appreciation. And that is the case of dance. Dance seems to be an instance where there are these difficult sequence of movements that you're engaged in, and yet you can still kind of both look for and achieve the appreciation of your own bodily movements. And that would be analogous to the player of the Twitch video game being able to appreciate their own bodily movements as they're engaged in the activity of playing the video game. And here's just a nice little passage that I think helps to illustrate this idea. So in the case of dance, it looks like we can have an awareness of features such as grace, tension, energy, or beauty as perceived by the dancer both consciously and through bodily feelings and sensory motor responses. However, I think that dance is actually not going to work, all right? So we're going to sort of say, no, dance is not going to be relevantly similar to Twitch gameplay to offer us a solution. And there's a number of reasons why, but primarily we want to notice that one interesting feature, and for our purposes an ineliminable feature of Twitch gameplay, is the fact that it has this kind of goal-directed character. That is to say, where the goal-directed character is not aesthetic appreciation. Rather, it's some gameplay task in the world. In the case of Pac-Man, which is, I think, a good paradigm case, it will be consuming all of the dots on a given level. That will be the goal, not aesthetically appreciating anything about either, so to speak, the object of the player's attention in the video game or the game player's own bodily movements. Neither of those is the goal that is sort of imputed to the player on the basis of their engaging in the playing of the video game. So it looks like if we're talking about Twitch video games that are directed towards goals that are not aesthetic appreciation, whereas the dancer who achieves aesthetic appreciation of the movements of their own body, they are trying to reach that experience. That's part of what they're trying to do. Then it looks like there's a significant disanalogy. In one case, the aim is to achieve this kind of aesthetic appreciation. In the other, it can actually interfere. Okay, so the goal of aesthetic appreciation in the case of Twitch gameplay can interfere with the goals in the game. A little bit more formally, we can say that in the case of dancing, attending to and seeking proprioceptive aesthetic engagement need not and often does not interfere with the activity of dancing. Indeed, in many cases, it enhances the activity and can perfect it. On the other hand, in the case of Twitch gameplay, attending to and seeking proprioceptive aesthetic engagement can and does generally interfere with achieving the ends set by the game world, particularly and especially when those ends are very difficult to achieve. What are we going to do about this? Now what we're going to try to do is answer the central problem restated. And our answer is going to be something like this. It's true that for the most part, in activities that resemble Twitch gameplay with respect to the attentional component of it, we mentioned the Tour de France, but we can think of a lot of analogous physical activities, maybe something like deadlifting or something like that, or swimming or something like that. So there are all of these physical activities, particularly in sports, where they're goal-directed and they're rule-bound, where it does appear, at least at first glance, as if using our attention to achieve our goals in those activities disallows us from aesthetic appreciation. On the other hand, it also seems like occasionally when our bodily movements kind of sync up in the right way, for lack of a better phrase, when we're able to execute a particular movement in an activity in just the right way, when everything clicks, so to speak, and I think many people have had this experience in a physical activity, when everything clicks, it actually feels beautiful, even though you're not attending to how it feels. That just is a, so to speak, a kind of epiphenomenal concomitant to the fact that we're engaged in this activity. So we're not trying to make it feel beautiful, we're not attending to the beauty of the movement, and nevertheless, it just so happens that the execution of the movement leads to the experience of beauty. And here's a passage, an extended passage that I think goes some way to try to articulate this notion of everything clicking in a sequence of bodily movements in a way that feels beautiful, despite the fact that that's not the goal. There are numerous examples, such as a well-executed dive, a finely timed stroke in squash, a smoothly accomplished series of movements in gymnastics. Aesthetic seems the most appropriate way to characterize them. The batsman's aesthetic experience is not necessarily dependent on his having time at the moment of playing the stroke to dwell upon it, nor is it limited to a retrospective contemplation of his performance. If he plays a perfectly timed cover drive, with the ball flashing smoothly and apparently effortlessly from the face of his bat to the boundary, the aesthetic satisfaction of the batsman is intrinsic to what he is doing. It need not depend upon detached or retrospective contemplation. We say that a stroke felt beautiful, and it is by no means unusual to experience aesthetic feelings, properly so called, while actually engaged and fully involved in physical activities. So it looks like there's an answer to the central problem, namely that it is possible to be fully engaged in Twitch gameplay while nevertheless also having an aesthetic experience of one's own bodily movements. Now, this does not require, and in fact precludes, actually attending to one's own bodily movement. So I'm not going to write that down, but just as kind of bearing in mind that it's possible to be fully engaged in Twitch gameplay, meaning in part that you're not trying to experience aesthetically your own bodily movements. You're not trying to do that, while also having an aesthetic appreciation, as it were, just contingently, as a matter of sort of lucky accident. So it looks like we at least have the grounds for saying that we can aesthetically appreciate Twitch gameplay in the most difficult circumstances. And what I'd like to do now is move on to a specific kind of variety of appreciation. And that specific variety of appreciation is harmony. And once again, in giving an account of harmony, I'm just going to borrow from an existing account that I think does a good job of capturing an interesting concept of aesthetic harmony that's applicable to the case of Twitch gameplay. Harmonious movement is when your abilities are pushed to their maximum, when your mind or body is just barely able to do what's required, when your abilities are just barely enough to cope with the situation at hand. It is a harmony between self and challenge, between the practical self and the obstacles of its world. On this account, harmony is a kind of perfect match between self and world, where the self involved is trying to engage in an activity with a particular kind of end, and the world is one that presents various challenges to the self, to the agent trying to achieve those goals, and that these sort of line up perfectly, so that you're just able to achieve the tasks that are called of you by the world, but only just barely. For example, Tom Bramwell, in his review of Super Meat Boy, says the following: "The weight of experience gradually flattens your muscular impulses into the exact grooves of success." Now, it looks like this occurs in excellent Twitch gameplay, and I want to try to give an explanation of the conditions of possibility for when a Twitch video game or Twitch gameplay sequence is a candidate for harmony. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this concept of harmony. We're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that some Twitch gameplay is able to instantiate or exhibit this kind of perfect match between self and world. And I encourage you to kind of think, if you've played a number of video games with Twitch gameplay elements, about maybe if you've had the experience yourself of this kind of lining up between the self and world that occurs in harmonious movement called for by the video game player. So we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that this harmony is a feature that is part of excellent Twitch gameplay, and we're going to try to give some necessary conditions which themselves make possible this kind of harmony. And these three necessary conditions that we'll talk about are going to be transparency, fairness, and fine-tuning. And we'll just briefly go through these in a kind of definitional fashion so that we can have our kind of conceptual toolbox ready to go when trying to think about how these necessary conditions make harmonious sequences of bodily movements possible in terms of Twitch gameplay. Controls are transparent insofar as the player's movements are translated and interpolated so seamlessly that the player experiences the movements of the in-game character immediately as their own. Fairness amounts to clear, consistent, and reliable mapping of player movement with in-game character behavior, where fine-tuning amounts to the design of the game world continually facilitates the use of fair and transparent controls to bring about episodes of proprioceptive aesthetic appreciation. One way to try to test out whether or not these necessary conditions are in fact necessary conditions for this harmonious match between agent self in the game world and the game world challenges presented to the self in confronting them in Twitch gameplay is to think about what happens if you don't have them. So what happens when a particular sequence or just a video game in general lacks transparency? So what happens when it's missing? Well, then it looks like the player does not experience the movements as their own, and therefore it's not, so to speak, a genuine self that's confronting the world. It's something else. The self is confronting the controller, and then somehow the controller is interfacing with the game world. The player isn't actually directly interfacing with the world at all unless the control scheme is transparent. If it is transparent, then the player is able to kind of directly interact with the game world instead of having to only interact with the controls and then through the controls to the game world. A similar kind of consideration will apply to fairness. What if fairness is missing? Okay, well then it looks like you're not going to be able to have a perfect match because of the fact that the obstacles will not seem genuine in some sense. They'll seem artificial or capricious. That is to say that it will seem as if sometimes you fail not because of a lack of effort and not because of a lack of ability, but rather because of some sort of mistake in the controls. So it looks like if controls are not fair, then that also prevents the arising of harmony. And the same thing, it seems to me, also holds in the case of fine-tuning being missing. That is to say, if a video game has transparent controls, that is to say you do experience your character's in-game movement as your own immediately, and they're fair, that is to say there is a kind of consistent mapping between your own movements and the behavior of the character in the game world. Nevertheless, it might, for example, just be incredibly easy. And if it's too easy, then it's not going to sort of provoke from the player the kind of sophisticated sequence of bodily movements that will yield this match between effort and obstacle, that the amount of effort required to reach the obstacle kind of is appropriate for the player. So that's why we have to include fine-tuning in addition to transparency and fairness. It's time to close with a short review. We started with a discussion of what we mean by aesthetics, and we stipulated that what we were going to mean is something like the union of an ancient concept and a more contemporary concept. The ancient concept, derived from that cluster of Greek words aesthesis, aesthetikos, and asthenomai, and deriving from the Proto-Indo-European chau. That idea of perception and sensation we then linked to a more contemporary notion of beauty. And we said that we were going to explore aesthetics under the general rubric of something like the perception and sensation of beauty, and really more specifically we were going to be interested in harmony. We moved to the problem of what kinds of gameplay we were talking about, and I tried to give something like a general characterization of what Twitch gameplay amounts to, focusing on challenging sequences of bodily movements. Then we talked about a central problem in aesthetically appreciating Twitch gameplay, namely the problem of attention, the fact that difficult Twitch gameplay requires maximal attention, and it also seems like many forms of aesthetic appreciation also require maximal attention, and therefore it looks as if one has got to give, so to speak. We looked at two replies to this central problem, one that I called the reflective appreciation and the other that I called the performative appreciation. After we looked at those two replies, we reformulated the problem in a way that was designed to avoid the reflective and performative replies. After we restated the problem, we did our best to try to answer it. And we tried to answer it by recognizing that there do seem to be some physical activities such that the bodily movements that one uses to achieve the ends of those activities can still be appreciated aesthetically even when the person isn't directing their attention toward the aesthetic experience of their own bodily movements. We concluded by looking at a specific instance of what looks like a kind of aesthetic excellence, namely harmony, And we looked at this idea under the general notion of a perfect match between self and world, and concluded with outlining some potential necessary conditions for the achieving of harmony.